Welcome. Today we're counting down from the lowest to the highest nominal GDP by state in the USA. Please strap in and enjoy. At number 50, Vermont. GDP of $40.83 billion and a population of 647,110. At number 49, Wyoming. GDP of $49.08 billion and a population of 581,629. At number 48, Alaska. GDP of $65.70 billion and a population of 733,276. At number 47, Montana. GDP of $67.07 billion and a population of 1,122,878. At number 46, South Dakota. GDP of $68.78 billion and a population of 909,869. At number 45, North Dakota. GDP of $72.65 billion and a population of 778,912. At number 44, Rhode Island. GDP of $72.71 billion and a population of 1,093,842. At number 43, Maine. GDP of $85.80 billion and a population of 1,389,338. At number 42, Delaware. GDP of $90.21 billion and a population of 1,019,459. At number 41, West Virginia. GDP of $97.42 billion and a population of 1,774,035. At number 40, Hawaii. GDP of $101.08 billion and a population of 1,439,399. At number 39, New Hampshire. GDP of $105.02 billion and a population of 1,399,003. At number 38, Idaho. GDP of $110.87 billion and a population of 1,938,996. At number 37, New Mexico. GDP of $125.54 billion and a population of 2,113,476. At number 36, Mississippi. GDP of $139.98 billion and a population of 2,938,928. At number 35, Nebraska. GDP of $164.93 billion and a population of 1,968,060. At number 34, Arkansas. GDP of $165.99 billion and a population of 3,046,404. At number 33, Kansas. GDP of $209.33 billion and a population of 2,936,716. At number 32, Nevada. GDP of $222.94 billion and a population of 3,177,421. At number 31, Iowa. GDP of $238.34 billion and a population of 3,199,693. At number 30, Oklahoma. GDP of $242.74 billion and a population of 4,019,271. At number 29, Utah. GDP of $256.37 billion and a population of 3,381,236. At number 28, Kentucky. GDP of $258.98 billion and a population of 4,511,563. At number 27, Alabama. GDP of $281.57 billion and a population of 5,073,903. At number 26, Louisiana. GDP of $291.95 billion and a population of 4,588,023. At number 25, Oregon. GDP of $297.31 billion and a population of 4,239,379. At number 24, South Carolina. GDP of $297.55 billion and a population of 5,282,955. At number 23, Connecticut. GDP of $319.34 billion and a population of 3,608,706. At number 22, Wisconsin. GDP of $396.21 billion and a population of 5,890,543. At number 21, Missouri. GDP of $396.89 billion and a population of 6,177,168. At number 20, Minnesota. GDP of $448.03 billion and a population of 5,714,300. At number 19, Indiana. GDP of $470.32 billion and a population of 6,832,274. At number 18, Arizona. GDP of $475.65 billion and a population of 7,365,684. At number 17, Maryland. GDP of $480.11 billion and a population of 6,163,981. At number 16, Tennessee. GDP of $485.66 billion and a population of 7,048,976. At number 15, Colorado. GDP of $491.29 billion and a population of 5,841,039. At number 14, Michigan. GDP of $622.56 billion and a population of 10,033,281. At number 13, Virginia. GDP of $663.11 billion and a population of 8,679,099. At number 12, Massachusetts. GDP of $691.46 billion and a population of 6,982,740. At number 11, North Carolina. GDP of $715.97 billion and a population of 10,695,965. At number 10, Washington. GDP of $738.10 billion and a population of 7,784,477. At number 9, New Jersey. GDP of $754.95 billion and a population of 9,260,817. At number 8, Georgia. GDP of $767.38 billion and a population of 10,913,150. At number 7, Ohio. GDP of $825.99 billion and a population of 11,759,697. At number 6, Pennsylvania. GDP of $911.81 billion and a population of 12,972,091. At number 5, Illinois. GDP of $1.025 trillion and a population of 12,582,515. At number 4, Florida. GDP of $1.439 trillion and a population of 22,245,521. At number 3, New York. GDP of $2.048 trillion and a population of 19,673,200. At number 2, Texas. GDP of $2.402 trillion and a population of 30,029,848. At number 1, California. GDP of $3.641 trillion and a population of 39,040,616. If you've enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you.